Our next speaker, Mallorie Vaudoise, is a Brooklyn-based spiritualist of Italian descent. She's currently apprenticing with renowned Italian folk musician Alessandra Belloni. Vaudoise is the creator of Italian folk magic, a blog dedicated to the cults of the Madonnas, saints, and the dead. Please welcome Mallorie Vaudoise.
Hi everyone.
Hello.
My name is Mallorie Vaudoise, and I just want to take a moment right now to thank Jesse and Dr. Al for inviting me here tonight, the lovely ladies at Morbid Anatomy for organizing this event, and the good people at House Ringworth for giving us a home for tonight. And I hope that I'm not disappointing too many of you in the audience when I reveal that tonight's talk is about Naples, Italy, not Naples, Florida. Although I'm pretty sure they have a lot of necromancy going on in Florida. They're probably like the necromantic capital of the US. This is the Naples that we're going to be talking about. It was first settled by Greek colonists in 2000 BCE, making it one of the oldest continuously inhabited urban areas in human history. And looming in the background, you see the form of Mount Vesuvius, which is one of the most dangerous volcanoes in the world due to the proximity of roughly 3 million people who live in the nearby countryside against their better judgment. Vesuvius is kind of like the physical manifestation of the constant threat of annihilation that has shaped southern Italian culture. It's a region that has suffered regular plagues, wars, earthquakes, foreign invaders, and famines, and that's in addition to the volcanic activity. So any religion that wants to take root in this soil needs to account for the background noise of existential threat, which is a feature of the landscape. Italy is officially a Catholic country, but as we'll see tonight, there are actually many cults that are active within the framework provided by Catholicism, including cults dedicated to saints, spirits of the dead, and the Madonna, as the Blessed Virgin Mary is called. There we go. So one such cult is found at Fontanelle Cemetery, an underground ossuary beneath the Mater Dei section of Naples. Most Neapolitans in the 16th century wanted to be interred in their local churches, but because space within the city limits was at a premium, older remains had to be transferred to a final resting place that had a larger capacity, enter the need for Fontanelle. Over the centuries, Fontanelle Cemetery became the place to bury the city's homeless, as well as people from all social classes during times of plague and war, when mass deaths could outpace the city's ability to deal with them. The cult operated primarily through individual mediums, who would establish a kind of necromantic pact with one of the anime pezzentelle, or lost souls, as the spirits of the dead buried in Fontanelle Cemetery are called. These are souls without families to care for them by paying for masses or offering indulgences in their name. If any of you are Catholic, that's standard necromantic tech that you should really look into. It's definitely worth getting familiar with. Participation in the cult was said to begin, as all good things do, with a dream. The devotee would meet a soul in her dream who would tell her where she could find the soul's skull in the caves beneath the city. And I say she because these devotees were almost exclusively female, and this cult was understood explicitly as women's work. The process of initiatory contact with the dead is described as adoption, and the words used to describe the souls themselves, such as anime pezzentelle, are diminutive. So the central metaphor at play is one in which the devotee is a mother and the soul that she works with is her child. And that's interesting to me because it's kind of it's an inversion of the usual Catholic metaphor in which the devotee is the child and the Madonna is his or her mother. And I've also seen several comments made to the effect by historians that this cult would experience intense waves of revival after plague or war, when not only were there a fresh new crop of souls to choose from, but there were also a lot of women mourning their children. Once the devotee had located the skull of her primary spirit contact within the caves, she would claim it by leaving a coin on it. Then she would begin a process of testing the soul's powers. The devotee would make requests, and if those requests were fulfilled, she would bring rewards of increasing value to the skull. She may begin with white embroidery or candles or rosaries, all of which were believed to ease the soul's suffering in the fires of purgatory by offering it refreshment. A particularly efficacious spirit would receive a small house where the skull could reside with more privacy and dignity than the other inhabitants of the cemetery. As the relationship between devotee and soul deepened, the soul would begin to share information about its earthly life, its social class, vocation, gender, whether it had any children, those types of mundane details. And since plague does not discriminate, the spirits of Fontenelle Cemetery could be literally anyone, offering the devotee access to uniquely diverse perspectives. In 1969, Cardinal Ursi of Naples decided that the cult had degenerated into fetishism and ordered the cemetery to be closed. It has recently reopened, but only as a historical landmark, and cult activities such as leaving refreshments out for the souls are now explicitly forbidden. Interestingly, I see a parallel here with what's happened in St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, a popular tourist destination in New Orleans where the famous voodoo priestess and modern folk saint Mallorie Vaudoise is buried. If you haven't been there in recent years, you can no longer enter St. Louis without a licensed tour guide who is responsible for making sure you don't leave any kind of offerings or mark tombs according to local custom. And while I sympathize with the desire to protect history so that future generations can enjoy it, I think that there is a tension here that it's worth calling out. Without the offerings, which are evidence of engagement with spirits, there wouldn't really be tourists going to Fontenelle Cemetery or to St. Louis. Life is messy, and we can't kill things in order to preserve them. Returning to Naples, the process of dream interpretation which would guide the devotee in her deepening relationship with her spirit contact was most likely personal or inherited through family. In practice, there is no universal dream dictionary. But we do find several fascinating texts from Campania, the region that Naples is in, which recorded comprehensive systems of dream interpretation that apparently worked for someone at some time, and which may have helped other practitioners to fill in the gaps when they needed inspiration. One such text, the famous Smorfia Napolitana, mapped dream images to the numbers 1 through 90 in order to generate bets to play in the Italian national lottery, because what else are you going to do if you can do magic? This practice might sound silly at first, but it reflects a worldview in which synchronicity exists between images and numbers and between days and names due to the symbiotic relationship between the living and the dead. The other side of this coin is none other than the Catholic ecclesiastical calendar itself, which maps days of the year to saint names. And I know some Italians still celebrate their Omastico, that is, the feast day of the saint that they were named for instead of their birthday. And because many Italians are named for dead relatives, there's kind of a necromantic side to this practice. Sometimes Italian Americans will reach out to me to ask about how they can learn more about their spiritual heritage. And often the first piece of advice that I have to give them is to just draw up a family tree and start to look for patterns in the names, because that's often indicative of a relationship with a saint that has transcended generations and is likely to have been inherited in some form. But while the Smorfia Napoletana is the best known Neapolitan dream dictionary, I have a special place in my heart for this book, Il Libro Magico di San Pantaleone, whose feast day is coming up, July 27th, in case you guys want to catch that. A Neapolitan grimoire of saint magic, which includes a dream dictionary called Il Libro delle Sette Streghe, the Book of Seven Witches. The Book of Seven Witches translates dream images into omens, which I find fit into the following categories. There are general good and bad omens. So for example, dreaming of a hot summer is a good sign, but dreaming of an owl is a bad sign. There are omens which predict specific events. So taking a bath indicates that a famine will come soon, while a small mouth predicts riches. Then there are omens which predict the outcome of some prayer which has been made. A clock indicates that the prayer is on its way to being fulfilled, while riding black horses indicates that prayer is useless in addressing the matter. And finally, there are instructions for making the prayer more efficacious. Building a church indicates that the prayers that have already been offered were sufficient. Seeing a cleric indicates that you must add a requiem for the dead to your prayers. And being blind in one eye warns that the prayer was misquoted. Interestingly, the way that the book is written seems to imply a social structure in which the operator is the person designated to dream on behalf of his or her family. This, along with the devotees at Fontanelle Cemetery who would build small houses for their working skulls, reminds me of something that we see in Italian-American culture, where women would often be responsible for praying to, communicating with, and sometimes even bargaining with the Madonnas and the saints. If a particularly important favor was received from one of their spirit contacts, they would ask their husbands, many of whom were stonemasons by trade back in the day, to build a yard shrine as a sign of gratitude. So the next time that you're walking down the street in Brooklyn and you see a beautiful bathtub Madonna like this one, keep in mind that that statue was not purely an aesthetic choice or even just a marker of ethnic identity. It was put there to honor a spirit who came through for the family that lived in that apartment in their moment of need. So far, the practices that we've discussed have focused on personal relationships with spirits, but I'd like to shift our focus now towards more community-oriented traditions. This is the Madonna dell'Arco, who resides in the town of Santa Anastasia near the city of Naples. This site was originally home to an edicola votiva, that is, a roadside shrine. It was called the Madonna dell'Arco after a nearby arch left behind from an ancient Roman aqueduct. On Easter Monday of 1450, a young man angry at losing a card game threw a ball at the image, whose cheek began to bleed where she had been struck. This was interpreted as a miracle by the local people, who consequently asked that the young man be put on trial, and he was found guilty and hanged. Which actually brings up another interesting point, which is that the Madonnas in southern Italy tend to kind of defy American expectations. They're not the kind of sweet, gentle, loving mother figure that American Catholics might have been introduced to in CCD. They're deadly, terrifying, and they demand respect, much like Italian mothers. This is precisely why they are worshipped, because they are powerful and they can use that power for us or against us, much as earlier pagan deities were believed to do. Since that first incident, the Madonna dell'Acqua has been celebrated every Easter Monday. Her most committed devotees are known as the Fuggenti, who you see in this image. They show their devotion to the Madonna by walking barefoot during her procession and even dropping to their knees and crawling on all fours when they enter her sanctuary. In many instances, Fuggenti who come close to the Madonna will fall to the ground, shouting and convulsing. And some may find this practice a bit similar to how practitioners of Afro-diasporic traditions might mount spirits in certain other ritual contexts. But you can judge for yourself because her devotees actually have a surprisingly active presence on Facebook, and they live stream this shit every year. The Madonna dell'Acqua is one of the famous Sette Sorelle, or seven sisters, each of whom is worshipped in a different site in Campania. These Madonnas are honored with traditional music, known as Tamuriate, which I have been honored to learn from my teacher, master folk musician Alessandra Belloni. Tamuriate is not simply a genre of music or dance. It is an ecstatic spiritual practice, something which Alessandra emphasizes in her work. It is embedded in the agricultural way of life of southern Italy. As one interview subject in the documentary Dancing on the Drum by Zoe DeMauro puts it, Tamuriate is an expression of everyday life. For me, it's my childhood, my people. It's me, my culture. It's not simply a matter of passion. It's something natural to me. Tamuriate is a moment in life. It rises and dies. The drum is made of a membrane that produces a vibration, a sound. At a certain point, after drinking some wine, when you begin to get closer to God, this sound takes you deeper and deeper into a state of trance. There, you start to perceive vibrations which you cannot normally perceive. So this isn't just some New Age idea that has been grafted onto an existing tradition. The practice of Tamuriate is, and always has been, about trance and contact with other parts of reality. Traditionally, it is not performed so much as experienced within the context of a religious feast. There is no stage, just a circle of musicians surrounding the dancers. Its lyrics, always explicitly sexual, are drawn from a vast repertoire, although the arrangement is improvised by the singer every time. The musicians interpret the lyrics into drumming patterns, which in turn correspond to certain dance steps. Much of the choreography mimics actions related to agricultural labor. The dance is partnered and resembles a courtship. Similar traditions of music and dance existed in the ancient world, particularly in the rites of the goddess Cybele and the god Dionysos, both of whom were worshipped through ecstatic rituals which called for frame drums similar to the ones used in Tamuriate today and which took place in the same geographical region. And both Cybele and Dionysos served religious functions related to death, dying, and the dead. Along with the cult at Fontenelle Cemetery, Tamuriate was suppressed by the powers that be in the 1950s and 60s. It made a comeback in the 1970s and again in the late 1990s, and is quite popular today. A related musical tradition, the Pizzica Tarantata from Puglia, has experienced a similar revival after years of suppression. That name means bite of the tarantula and refers to the phenomenon of tarantismo, which was first described in the 11th century. Tarantismo is commonly described according to the following mythic pattern. A peasant woman is working in the fields at high noon when she is bit by a spider or a snake, or stung by a scorpion and then overcome by illness. Perhaps manic or perhaps melancholic, the woman, who is called a tarantata, will die if drastic measures are not undertaken. The only known cure is an ecstatic dance ritual which can last anywhere from 3 to 7 days. During this time, a group of musicians must play continuously, allowing her to dance the poison out. It's a stunning scene. but it excludes a few key details which are related to us by Ernesto de Martino in his classic book, The Land of Remorse. De Martino explains that each spider had its own rhythm and color. The musicians would need to play several options, watching the body of the tarantata for a response. When the correct music was played, the tarantata would leap to her feet and begin dancing uncontrollably. The women from the village would put out their clothes so that once in communion with the spirit of the animal that bit her, the tarantata could dress herself in its heraldic colors. Many tarantate learned the names of their spiders, which were usually female, and even after a cure was received, the tarantata would typically need to undertake a similar ritual once a year to avoid the deterioration of her condition. Most often, this would take place on June 29th, and a similar ceremony is going to be held at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine uptown, if you're interested, and Alessandro will be conducting the ceremonies there. But I emphasize these elements because I find them shockingly similar to another tradition of music and dance found in nearby lands, Zar. Zar is a women's spirit possession cult found primarily in Egypt, Sudan, Ethiopia, and Somalia, although similar traditions are found in other parts of Africa and the Middle East. Within the worldview of Zar, spirits of the dead sometimes choose female hosts to possess. At first, this possession is experienced as an illness, but over time it may evolve into positive concern for the host's well-being, particularly once she's undergone a healing ceremony, which involves music, dance, and animal sacrifice, and like the ritual used to cure the tarantata, typically lasts 3 to 7 days. After the ceremony, the initiate learns how to allow the spirit to enter her body through deliberate trance rather than unwilling possession. Like the tarantismo ritual, the Zar ceremony involves drumming, dance, and costumes, which correspond to the spirit's identity. And like the tarantata, the Zar initiate must perform sacrifices to her spirit once a year in order to stay on good terms with it. I am not the first person to comment on the ritual similarities between tarantismo and Zar, and if these similarities have not led us astray, we may infer some beliefs from the oral tradition of tarantismo which did not make it into the written record. The spider, snake, or scorpion may have been the spirit of a deceased person afflicting the tarantata, and once she had appeased that spirit through the proper rituals, the tarantata may have had a relationship with it, which enabled her to do the things that we call magic. When I was younger, I looked around and I saw the paucity of magic in my culture as an Italian American, and I assumed that it must be because magic is like some very technical thing. And you know, I'm a very technical person. I'm actually a software engineer by training, so like that's what I was looking for, right? But when we take a step back and we look at all of the cults that we've talked about tonight side by side, Fontanelle Cemetery, the Madonna d'Arco, Tarantismo, what we notice is that there's actually very little set in stone. Even the lyrics of the Tamuriata are improvised. There are technologies, yes, the white embroidery left out for the anima pezzentella, the self-mortifications performed by the fuyenti, and the traditional rhythms of the pizzica tarantata, but these are shockingly simple practices, not much more complicated than lighting a candle and saying a prayer. So I think the challenge is not in the technique. The techniques, after all, are just a starting point. Necromancy is a conversation with the dead, and the traditional techniques will establish a connection, but it's up to the devotee to speak and to listen in turn. The real challenges come once that connection has been established. And I think that these challenges will look familiar to anyone. Who do you trust? Who has the power to help you? How do you maintain boundaries? And how do you do right by the ones you love? Today, I feel like we're seeing this new wave of interest in magic and the occult, and consequently, I see see a lot of people posting pictures on Instagram of like altars covered in animal skulls and crystals. And well, don't get me wrong, that's totally my aesthetic, or at least one of my many aesthetics. I'm less interested in seeing your skulls and more interested in seeing what you do with them. Because the dead can reveal many things, from hidden histories to possible futures to winning lottery numbers. So please bring them interesting questions. Thank you.
Would you guys like to take some questions? Would you like to go back on stage, although we don't have chairs? Would you bring your chairs, maybe? Bring chairs?
I'm new to necromancy, so forgive me if this is a one-on-one level question. What do you guys do in your personal lives for your rituals to commune with the dead that you want to talk to or, love on?
That question.
Hello?
That question is dope. And also, I think, speaking as someone who trained as a software engineer, I feel like it is kind of public service announcement time. When a community makes people apologize for feeling like they're asking one-on-one questions, that's a sign of a toxic community. So please keep asking questions regardless of whether you think that they're good questions or not. That's kind of an important part of the dialogue that these two have started to kind of strike up through the Folk Necromancy Facebook group and through their podcast, Radio Free Golgotha. In terms of my personal practice, I'm afraid it's probably going to look quite vanilla. At least the stuff that I will admit to publicly will look quite vanilla. So the cult at Fontenelle Cemetery is very much embedded in that terroir. It exists because of the fact that certain historical forces have resulted in a bunch of unresolved dead, restless dead, as Dr. Al brought up earlier, who are ready, willing, and eager to interact with people. And so there really isn't much sense in trying to recreate that if you do not live near a major ossuary, which as far as I know, New York has many things, but no major ossuaries or charnel houses nearby. I am a practicing Catholic, and I know that for some people that's going to be like a bridge too far, and that's cool. So a lot of the prayer that I use is Catholic prayers, whether those are official prayers in Latin or whether those are folk prayers in the various regional languages of my ancestors, including Neapolitan and Sicilian. And I find that in doing the drumming work that I do with Alessandra and learning to alternate through certain states of trance, that prayer becomes this whole other thing. It's no longer just like, maybe what your mom made you do before bed, but it's actually a great way of facilitating, a connection with something other than yourself.
So I'm very interested in that idea of, I don't know if I'm projecting on that question there. You said, like, what do you do with your dead? And I'm really interested in, like, who are the dead you consider yours? So, for instance, I'm from the Midlands, from Birmingham, so in the UK, so all my nans are Irish, because that's the rule. And so we have a bunch of the similar naming traditions. So, I have pictures on the wall of, my great-grandmother, who regularly talked to our dead relatives and set places for them, and also taught pranayama yoga for 45 years. When she was asked how she squared her Irish Catholicism with her pranayama practice that she would do in Mass, she would say, well, I sit, I'm not going to do her accent, I would sit next to a pillar, so in case it won't look too in, and I just don't tell the priest. So I have her up, right? And I also have I work with some saint statues, that have the same names as my Irish dead that I know about because of our strange Irish naming traditions. My middle name is Joseph, after my Uncle Harry, whose middle name was also Joseph. It skips generations and does strange loop-de-loops and things like that, but it's also why my father is Michael, and so I work with a variety of statues at the very least that provides access, shall we say, to a set of those saints and archangels, and also that they provide a sense of the access to those lines. That said, my dead I also consider in some ways that a good responsible necromancer can be, providing a safe sort of astral super kitchen occasionally, with some strong provisos and limitations and the equivalent of bouncer spirits that I talked about. And so there are traditions of feeding the lonely souls in purgatory, of praying for them, of offering them water and refreshment, in much the same way that we talked about refresca for the skulls at Fontenelle. And also doing certain things at the nearest cemetery to me, cemeteries when I go and visit them. Real arcane stuff like picking up trash and that kind of thing, and hopefully being of some kind of service, amongst other things. Hopefully it's not all take. I hope that makes some kind of sense.
I think the examination of your relationship with your own dead and family is the start in many traditions into working with dead that aren't of your family. I think it's also good to allow for milk children, as we would say in Spanish, but the adopted family, the family that you chose and have chosen, and the lineage of those people, which can also include professions, cities, the dead that have inhabited your space of living. What do you know about the former owners of your apartment? Who has exchanged their last breath there? And who are you sharing that breath with still? With family, I think the healthy way to engage it is also to examine for myself, the patterns that I want to encourage in myself, and to actively heal the patterns that are destructive towards my aims in life, that were laid down by family. And sometimes this is the second layer to the work. There is the kind of wonderful quote unquote worship of the dead, but is an interaction and exchange of offerings and prayers, and trying to get to that point of spirit contact and spirit sight where hopefully you or someone in your family can speak on behalf of the dead. And this is the other thing that in a lot of the extant traditions of this sort, the pressure is not all on you. If someone has the gift, nourish them, encourage them, support them so that they can perform this for you. It does not have to be everyone becomes a super duper necromancer. In empowering others, we empower ourselves, and in a family, that is one of the best divisions of labor. So I think in understanding what is necessary for the dead and the multiple inheritances that we receive, as well as those we do not want to receive anymore, and how do we heal the dead so that those patterns isn't just about our saying, I don't accept that pattern of abuse in a family member or whatever this is, but how does that abuse cycle get healed so that future generations in your family are not subject to those influences and patterns. And it's funny, in raising the dead, we raise ourselves. I'm a firm believer in the ladder principle, that in order to ascend the ladder, you must bring somebody up to the rung below you, so that there's no vacuum and things don't fall, which means we are ultimately trying to empower and build each other up. And specialization is great, diversification is great, but how do I engage the dead? Hopefully in some manner and in some way, the way that I engage the living. And how do I converse with the dead? The patterns of how I'm able to communicate with the living are there too. And there are certain allowances. We walk around naked in our house and forget that, the dead shrine is active and great grandma's seeing you diddle yourself is a totally different adventure. But have to perhaps, social mores aside, I think establishing patterns in your living life of interacting with people will help you greatly in how you interact with the dead. And again, build each other up and let what needs to die, allow it to die, and what needs to move on. And you don't have to make those judgments yourself. You can include friends and family and your children. Have great conversations with 4-year-olds about who they remember that they never met and what they want from that interaction. So I think the fun part of your questions and asking what we're doing, it kind of is, it seems like you're also asking what can you do, which is, hey, that's awesome.
Any other question? Raise your hand.
Hello. So recently, my grandmother and stepmother moved on, and I missed the presentation, so my question might be completely off base. But I had an experience in my room where I used cannabis, and there was a moment in between, right after my grandmother's funeral and right after my stepmother's funeral, where I just felt an immense amount of love. It was really strange, and I started bawling my eyes out. I wasn't sad, I was extremely ecstatic, and it's the only 2 times it's ever happened in my life. And I'm wondering if chemicals or substances can be used as a lubricant or a vehicle to necromancy, whether you or friends of yours. Or was I just delusional from the cannabis? Like, have you heard of anything about this? Was it a hypermanic state? Just some feedback, thank you.
First of all, I would say my condolences, but it sounds like you're having an easy transition here and that there's love on both sides. So I guess really congratulations. That's a rare experience in this culture, unfortunately. There's an incredible book called Cannabis and Spirituality by Stephen Gray is the editor, and in it he interviews several Brazilian people involved in the Santo Daime Church, which is a syncretization of ayahuasca medicine with Christianity. And there was apparently a kind of controversy within the Daime community, which came about when cannabis first was introduced into the rituals. So Daime, that is ayahuasca, is kind of syncretized with Christ, and then cannabis came in and became syncretized with who I would call the Madonna. It was called in the community of Santa Maria. And I think part of the reason for the controversy is because of the fact that cannabis is regarded as particularly attracting spirits of the dead. And depending on what type of spiritual work you're doing, the reason why you are interacting with Christ consciousness or Daime, that might actually be kind of running in like an opposite direction. But that being said, there is certainly, I guess, kind of like a traditional precedent for what it sounds like you have experienced, and I'm sure something that a lot of my friends have also experienced. But of course, morbid anatomy, Italian folk magic, and Radio Free Golgotha do not encourage the use of any kind of illegal or illicit substances. Can somebody take this away before I say?
The question, I think, from similar experiences in the friend's use of psilocybina. Did you use cannabis or did cannabis use you? Is another question. But I think also there's a lot of emphasis in the way our culture tries to dismiss experiences that are not shared by other people. And that's bullshit. The body does not know the difference between your amorous dream and you enacting it on the emotional level, in the physical, corporeal, shared reality, sensus reality. I'm reminded of discussions we've had, Al, on early modern concepts of seeing and ideas. The Catholic concept of sin and thought is sin indeed. It's based in this, that if you engage in fantasy, daydream, you're in effect doing that action on some level. So one of the things that happens in spirit contact training is we often tell the person, okay, you don't see anything, pretend that you see something. What color is it? What season is it? What does its voice sound like? And then you start realizing like, oh my God, am I making this up? Or is this actually, doesn't matter because I'm having extreme life positivity or negativity around this interaction. So the first thing I'd say is, if you got a positive experience out of it, fuck what anybody else says. And on the other side of it, keep sending light and love to your dead, and that envision them sending it to you, and then what do you do with that receipt of that and how you interact in the world? That's the next step.
It feels like they gave me a lot of knowledge. I'm like a different person since there's people are asking me if I'm a celebrity, am I a comedian?
Yes, you are. You're talking to the dead.
What'd you say?
You are. You're talking to the dead.
Nice.
You're a celebrity. I mean, we can go over and say that you're now a lighthouse, and I'm referencing Ghost, not just the actress who's a person, but the idea that you could find yourself in a lighthouse situation where you are, if we talk about the ocean of the dead, that now things are sailing towards you to try and communicate.
Yeah.
One of the reasons we build up with ancestral dead first is because those communications are the easiest. The promises, the love that continues, the strong emotions that linger. These are their own ghosts, their own spirits, their own demons. But can they be used as a tool? Yes. Could they be used as a crutch? Yes. Could they be used as destructive engagement in the high and the addiction and dependency? Yes. Could necromancy be an addiction like anything else? Yes. But, awesome, congratulations. It's a good way to phrase that.
What role do sacred objects or relics or psychometry or charged objects play in all your work? I noticed that Al talked about a hazel wand, for instance, and I'm sure they're in the Catholic realm, bones of the saints, arms of benediction, etc.
You're talking materials,
Yes.
tools, and things like that, right? So one of the things about the grimoires, the medieval and early modern texts of ritual magic, and there are many kinds of magic books, and books that are magic and books that are about magic, but grimoires are generally said to be particular systems, and one of the things that we kind of get out of them through their filtering through a bunch of the Victorian occultists who got very interested in them is these supposedly huge long lists of elaborate procedures. So it's not just a hazel wand necessarily. One might need to go and cut a branch of a hazel tree that hath not fruited its nut yet on a particular hour on a Sunday with a single cut from a knife that has been made from metal that has killed someone and then been reforged on a particular day after you've turned 3 times sunwards watching a crow fly, etc., etc., etc. Some of this is hyperbole. Some of these 19th century takes on how quote-unquote impossible grimoires are is itself seems a little absurd and frankly lazy, right? Some of it is procedure that can be done. You can get up at sunrise or before sunrise and go to the hazel that you found and cut a rod of a year's growth with a single cut. That's not impossible. And so what interests me in the question about what materials I use or what tools are less about saying you should definitely use hazel and you should never use cypress, and more about the process of gathering them and consecrating them. And consecration not simply as something that's done once, but continually. I, for instance, really enjoy using non-permanent marker of various sorts, chalk, on when I write the names or the seals of spirits on the objects that I use with them, because by handling them, that chalk is wiped off on me and on the things I'm doing, and so I have to re-chalk it. I have to rescale my relationship with that spirit. I end up remembering what it was that I was doing. I am remembering something and giving it more limbs, more neural pathways of every time I've done that. So for me, I use a lot of materials from grimoires. I do use a hazel wand and an elder wand from the Grimoire of Verum, which is one of my, you're not meant to have favourite grimoires, but that's one of mine.
objects that were inherited, deceased from loved ones, etc.?
No, those were one of those was
Mallorie.
one of those was given by a friend and sort of elder of mine. But I knew a magician who received I used some of the equipment from a magician who passed on his equipment before he died. He received a terminal cancer prognosis and didn't tell anyone, and got a bunch of credit cards and went on a massive tour of the world and took innumerable pictures that he sent to everyone he loved, and then had made arrangements to walk off into a desert. So yes, I also use some tools from a magician friend of mine who happens to be dead. Yeah, I'm going to let these lovely people talk.
In terms of the relationship with my blood ancestors, I find that the charged object that's the most important there is my body, because they made it for me, which is great. Yeah, thanks. They gave me the space, it's great. And you can't spell necromancer without romance, guys. With regard to the veneration of relics, so there's several types of relics. Quick catch up on catechism. There are first-degree relics, which are actual people pieces. And then there are second-degree relics, which are things that have been touched to a first-degree relic. I'm sorry, that's a third-degree relic. And then second is things that they had in their lives. So St. Padre Pio's very fashionable fingerless gloves. And for me, personally, in my relationship with the saints, who I didn't really talk about too much tonight, there needs to be a revisited connection with something tangible and physical for that relationship to be real. So I personally am not a fan of the kind of phone book approach to the saints where it's like, well, this week I need love, so I'm just going to look up who the love saint is, and then I'm going to print out a picture from the internet, and then, that works for some people. It doesn't really work for me. And so in my relationships with certain saints, I try to go on their feast day to their mass in their shrine church and have a contact experience with the relic when it's put out for veneration. And I find that is kind of the charge that I really need to sustain the connection with them the rest of the year, that I can kind of call back on that moment. And I think you can do similar things with pilgrimage. Sacred space is so important, and I think with a lot of the Madonnas who obviously don't really have relics, because even though they are kind of a historical person who lived and died, they're also kind of not. They're related to specific places in the land. They're in Italy, at least, they're often up on a mountaintop, or they were fished out of the sea, or something like that. And so you can also kind of extend this idea of contagion and make it into a pilgrimage, and maybe you go once a year, maybe you go once every 10 years, but allowing yourself to really be present with something that's real, as opposed to just having it purely be an idea, I think brings it into this plane in a very special way. Yeah, do you want to add to that?
In addition to the emphasis on the body and the book, which is an inheritance, which the lineage in Western magic is the book. This book was written by this person who was written, was this given to this person, given to this person. Even the citation of authority that you can command spirits is by saying, I am ultimately a child of Adam, who is a child of God, and my authority comes in this way, or I can trace my authority to Solomon, and therefore I am Solomon, and you should pay attention because I have his inheritance here. In addition to those, I'm very interested in the remapping of the landscape we're on. And this can be taken to a very colonial extreme if you're not careful, where you mandate what everybody should remap the landscape as. But this happens a lot in Afro-diasporic traditions. I'm involved in Reglador, Chamasantero, as well as Aquimandero, so Orisha tradition that went to Cuba, and as well as the Congolese sorcerer's tradition that grew up in Brazil. And these two systems, both of them, are very concerned with the local, that things have to manifest through the land that we are on. One such way is that if I am worshiping, working with, I guess is a better term, the English word worshiping is strange, but it's another issue. If I'm working with a river deity, and I am not paying attention to the health and nature of these rivers here, what am I doing? If I am working with the dead, but have never been to the local cemetery, well, in Catholic tradition, there's the thing of spirit roads, that every house has a unique way in which the spirits move back to the house of the living. They are not necessarily the same as these roads, and in some parts of the Mediterranean culture especially, which, let's face it, Catholicism is a Mediterranean cult of the dead dressed in Judeo lore. That's its pragmatism on Roman Catholicism. So we can look at technologies of the dead that are there, of creating restless dead, i.e. saints, that must perform miracles because the only respite they get is by offering prayers at Mass. So we could look at that technology from the outside or from the inside and say that these are performing miracles because they were blessed people. If we look at it in a cemetery, Catholic cemeteries have a large central cross called a cruzeiro in Portuguese. It is a kingdom all in itself because this is the stabilizing force of the cemetery, and it is a memory of the great death of Jesus. But it is also, when you go to a cemetery and you do not have your physical dead buried there, where do you pray for them? You can go to a church, but if you want to leave offerings, it's pretty hard to leave Coca-Cola and a Philly cheesesteak right on the communion altar. So to go and leave an offering at the Cruzeiro for your dead, because they're not buried there, the Cruzeiro becomes a place of gathering for all spirits. It is the stabilizing force because we are working through the memory of the resurrection of Jesus and the life eternal in these syncretic ways. And I preface my Catholicism with the sense of, I grew up Hispanic Catholic. There's nothing besides Catholicism. It's all Catholic. There's Santo Buddha, there's Santo Ganesha. That's just the way my grandmother thought. And I'm happily celebrating that. So I give implant the seed of remapping your sacredness onto the landscape. We are not just enacting pastoral nostalgia in our apartment buildings by pretending that we are 19th century yeomen worshiping a fertility goddess. No offense to those that find fulfillment in that. But go into the local parks at least, build an establishment with your trees, get a tree guide and look at the trees that are growing around you. When we start having carbon footprints on our sacred plants that are so ridiculous, and we still don't know the native weeds that are growing here or the plants that are growing outside our window, that's something else. So as far as sacred tools and empowerment, let's use, I think it's local, great. Worship local, use local, relic local, something. And also just lineage of when you engage in a tradition that is of the community also helps determine sacredness. And oftentimes in these lists of associations and grimoires and magic lists that are going, if I want to work with an Orisha, and I have a list that is the deities of the Cuban Orisha tradition. If I want to do a lamp for love, and I have all these herbs that could bring love, but I ultimately have to go to the spirit and say, do you want to do it with this recipe the way it is? Because if that spirit says no, what the hell? It's like saying, you know what? You seem like a nice person. I'm going to make you food, and I'm going to do the best lasagna that you've ever had, but you don't eat meat, you don't eat cheese, and you're gluten intolerant. You won't accept the meal. And there's this way of meeting also community in these traditions. Consecrate your shrines for you. So a lot of the rituals, the most pivotal rituals in our lives as priests are performed for us, and we are very little a part of it. It happens after. They initiate the change, much like they say a pilgrimage starts when you leave the holy place, when you go back home into the world. So when a community consecrates your shrine for you, you're sitting in the other room in Penitencio with a shoe over your head, and you're like, this is the most boring, horrible thing I've ever done in my life. And everybody else is doing the thing behind that white curtain, and the ritual's happening, and they're doing this thing, and they hand you this thing, and you're like, oh, okay, great, this is lovely. You engage in that contract, and it starts. Study starts at that point. So I guess that's another side of it, is what is sacred is not only determined by us sometimes.
Thank you, friends.